June 25th, 2009, a day that started like any other, but ended in a way the world is still trying to fully understand. Just hours before everything went wrong, Michael Jackson was on stage at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, rehearsing for what was meant to be his biggest comeback. Crew members and dancers later said he was focused, sharp, even surprisingly full of energy. The This Is It tour, a series of 50 sold-out shows in London, wasn't just another project. It was supposed to redefine his legacy. After years of controversy and absence from the spotlight, this was Michael's moment to take control again. Multiple witnesses, including choreographer Kenny Ortega, described that final rehearsal as strong and promising. Michael was engaged, hitting his marks, and even joking with the team. No one in that arena could have imagined this would be the last time they would ever see him alive. Later that night, inside his rented mansion in Holmby Hills, Los Angeles, everything changed. According to official reports, Michael was struggling with severe insomnia, something he had reportedly been dealing with for years. His personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, was with him that night, attempting to help him sleep. Sometime in the early morning hours of June 25, Michael stopped responding. But this is where things start to feel complicated. The exact timeline of events inside that room has always been a point of scrutiny. Dr. Murray later told investigators that he had been administering various sedatives throughout the night. Eventually, he gave Michael Propofol, a powerful anesthetic normally used in surgical settings, not for treating insomnia at home. According to Murray, he briefly left Michael's bedside, and when he returned, Michael wasn't breathing. But investigators would later question that version of events. Then came the emergency call. At 12:21 p.m., a 911 call was placed from the residence. But the call itself raised concerns. The caller, not Dr. Murray, but a staff member, struggled to answer basic questions from the dispatcher. There was confusion about Michael's condition, uncertainty about whether he was breathing, and no clear communication about what had already been done to help him. Meanwhile, crucial details, like the medications involved, were not immediately shared. In emergencies like this, seconds matter, and yet those seconds seemed lost in uncertainty. By the time paramedics arrived, Michael Jackson was unresponsive. They attempted resuscitation for over 40 minutes before transporting him to Ukala Medical Center. Despite continued efforts, he was pronounced dead at 2:26 p.m. He was 50 years old. But what really happened in those critical moments before help was called? Because when investigators later reconstructed the timeline, inconsistencies began to appear. Phone records showed that Dr. Murray made several calls before dialing 911. There were questions about the delay in seeking help, and perhaps most importantly, questions about why a drug like Propofol was being used outside of a hospital setting at all. In 2011, Dr. Conrad Murray was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The court concluded that his actions, particularly the improper use of Propofol and failure to provide adequate medical care, directly contributed to Michael Jackson's death. But even with a verdict, the timeline of that morning still leaves people uneasy. Not because the cause of death is unknown, but because of how those final moments unfolded, and how in a life or death situation, everything seemed just slightly out of sync. To understand what really went wrong, you have to look at one thing: a drug that was never meant to be used like this. Propofol. It's not some sleeping pill. It's a powerful anesthetic, the kind doctors use to put patients completely unconscious before major surgery. When administered, it doesn't just make you sleep, it shuts down awareness within seconds. That's why it's strictly controlled and almost always used inside hospitals under constant monitoring. Because here's the danger: Propofol can slow down your breathing, even stop it entirely. That's why trained anesthesiologists use it alongside oxygen support, heart monitors, and emergency equipment. Without those safeguards, even a small miscalculation can turn fatal, fast. So naturally, this drug is never meant to be used at home. And yet in Michael Jackson's case it was. According to reports, Propofol was being administered inside his bedroom. Not a hospital, not a clinic, but a private residence. No proper monitoring equipment, no full medical team, just one doctor, and a drug that demands an entire system to be used safely. That alone should have been unthinkable. But it happened, which leads to the question no one could ignore. How did a hospital-grade anesthetic, something so tightly controlled, end up being used casually, night after night, in someone's home? And more importantly, who allowed this to continue? Because when you really think about it, this alone raises serious questions. At the center of everything was one man, the only person who was there when Michael Jackson collapsed, his personal doctor, Dr. Conrad Murray. According to official reports, Murray was responsible for monitoring Michael that night, the one administering the drugs, the one watching over him as he slept. Which means, when things started to go wrong, he should have been the first to act. But this is where the story begins to break apart. Murray claimed he stepped away briefly, just for a couple of minutes, but when he returned, Michael wasn't breathing. A few minutes. That's all it takes for the brain to start suffering irreversible damage. But instead of immediately calling emergency services, there was a delay, and no one has ever been able to clearly explain why. Some reports suggest he tried to revive Michael himself. Others say he panicked. But the timeline he provided didn't stay consistent. Small details kept changing. The sequence of events didn't line up the same way twice, and in a situation where every second matters, those inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Because the biggest question wasn't just what happened, it was what didn't happen, and when. Why wasn't 911 called immediately? What exactly was happening in those crucial moments before help was finally requested? Because when investigators looked closer, they realized something chilling. There was a gap. A window of time where no one could clearly account for what was really going on. And in a case like this, those missing moments aren't just details. They could be everything. Those missing minutes may have changed everything. By the time paramedics finally arrived, the situation was already critical. Michael Jackson was lying unresponsive, and according to official reports, he was not breathing. His pulse was either absent or extremely weak, a full cardiac arrest scenario. In cases like this, emergency protocol is clear. Immediate CPR is started, along with advanced life support, oxygen, medications, and continuous monitoring, because those first few minutes are the difference between life and death. And to their credit, paramedics did begin resuscitation efforts as soon as they reached him. But here's where things start to feel complicated. When paramedics entered the room, they had limited information about what had happened beforehand. Early reports indicate that they were not initially told about the use of Propofol, a critical detail that could influence treatment decisions. Instead, they were dealing with a patient in cardiac arrest without a fully clear medical picture. In emergencies, even small gaps in information can create delays in making the most effective decisions. Then comes another question. Why transport him to the hospital instead of continuing treatment entirely on site? Under normal circumstances, paramedics often attempt to stabilize a cardiac arrest patient at the scene before moving them. However, in Michael Jackson's case, CPR was already in progress when they decided to transport him to UCLA Medical Center. According to official statements, the decision to move him was based on several factors, including the need for more advanced equipment and the hospital's ability to continue prolonged resuscitation efforts. In high-profile cases like this, transport isn't unusual, but it does add another layer of urgency. And once again, the timeline isn't perfectly simple. Different reports and testimonies over time have described slightly different sequences of events, not necessarily contradictory, but not perfectly aligned either. For example, the exact condition Michael was in when paramedics arrived has been described with slight variation. The duration and type of resuscitation efforts before transport have minor inconsistencies depending on the source, and most importantly, what information was communicated and when remains a key point of discussion. Some medical professionals later reviewed the case and raised questions, not claiming that everything was handled incorrectly, but pointing out that the situation itself was far from ideal, because the biggest issue wasn't just what paramedics did, it was what they didn't know when they arrived. And that uncertainty is what continues to surround this case, because when trained professionals look back and still find gaps in clarity, it leaves room for doubt, not necessarily about the outcome, but about those critical moments in between, the moments where every second mattered, and where even small uncertainties can change everything. In the end, the world was given an answer. Dr. Conrad Murray was charged, put on trial, and eventually convicted of involuntary manslaughter. The court concluded that his actions, the use of Propofol outside a proper medical setting, the lack of monitoring, the delay in response, directly led to Michael Jackson's death. For many, that should have been closure, a verdict, a sentence, a name held responsible. Case closed, but it didn't feel that simple. Because while the trial answered some questions, it left many others untouched. Why was Michael relying so heavily on such dangerous medication in the first place? How long had this been going on behind closed doors? And were there others who knew or chose not to intervene? The focus remained on one man, but the situation itself felt much bigger. Fans around the world couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, that the full story, the complete truth, had never really come out. Even years later, debates continue. Was it negligence or something more complex? Was it a tragic mistake or a chain of decisions that should have never been allowed? Because when you look at everything, the timeline gaps, the drug involved, the unanswered questions, it doesn't feel like a clean conclusion. It feels incomplete. And maybe that's why, to this day, people are still searching for answers, still questioning, still wondering, was this really just an accident?